Ah yes, collabs. I feel like this is one of those things that tend to polarize the fan base of an IP quite a fair bit. Either people are really in love and excited for them, or people just wish that the IP would stop collaborating with all of these other IPs out there and just focus on their own world building. And this is especially the case when your collabs are more of these skibbity variants instead. So why do companies do it, and how exactly does it work when you try to organize a collab? Well, as someone who has worked in the Japanese game industry for quite a few years, including on both live ops and development, and the live ops actually includes working on some of the collab heavy titles out there, including Puzzles and Dragons, let's dig into this from the Japanese perspective, since there are quite a few MMOs as well as mobile games out there that do come out of this region a fair bit. And before any of you smartasses out there decide to push up your glasses and go like, heh, but it's all about the money. Yes, I do know that the end goal for all companies is the money, but how exactly does this connect to money, and in what fashions are they trying to achieve that goal through collabs is what we're basically going to be exploring today. So we're not looking at the very end goal because that's a little short-sighted, but instead just the process of how all of this translates into the end goal as well. And the answer to that is very simply just DAU, or daily active users. I'm just gonna point this out now, since this is a term I've used in a few videos in the past as well, and some people have asked me what it means. Look, it's just marketing jargon that people use to basically seem smarter than they actually are. And what it basically is referring to is the number of active users that a game has that are unique for every single day that's in operation. Sometimes you don't use daily, you use monthly instead, but either way, these are the two metrics that a company uses to decide whether or not its live ops title is doing well. And the main goal of collabs is to try to help these numbers stay high. So to put it very simply, the main goal is usually user acquisition, where you try to get new people into your game so that they would stay for the long term, giving you more long term sustainability as well as growth. Two things that companies, especially public companies, tend to look at very heavily when it comes to deciding the health of a title. And yes, I do know that collabs can earn a lot of money as well, and I should know best because I used to work on Puzzles and Dragons, a title where almost 60 to 70% of the events within the game are just all collabs, and where collabs bring in a huge part of the game's revenue. But in that specific case, especially for games that are older like Monster Strike or Puzzles and Dragons, it tends to be a bit more of a unique case because these are games where collabs are a much bigger and more frequent thing, to the point that it kind of overlaps with what you would consider your standard time limited events within the game. And so it has a double purpose as both being the engine with which you will pull people into your game, as well as to some extent being the thing that will bring in profitability as well. However, typically when you see a collab do well, one of two things has to be true. Either the collab is very meta, which is to say that whatever you get from the collab itself is actually very usable within the game's current environment. You can think of something like the One Ring in Magic the Gathering, where it is a card from a Lord of the Rings collab, but because it is used in certain competitive formats as well, and it's a very good card all around, there are many decks out there that do incorporate it, and due to its rarity, it tends to be very expensive, and the set also tended to do very well within the player base itself, not just the external casual crowd that was buying the packs just to gamble on the one very expensive version of the card. And the other is that the collab IP itself is simply just that massive that it brings in a huge amount of players, and out of that player base that it brings in, you just need a fraction of them to spend on the game when they come in, and it actually brings in a huge amount of profits. That or the game also has a level of overlap between its player base as well as the fan base of that IP. You can think of something like Kimetsu no Yaiba, Demon Slayer for Puzzles and Dragons back in its heyday when the Demon Slayer IP was still super popular. That basically drove the profitability of the game quite a fair bit up during the period that it was released, simply due to the fact that it was a title that was so popular that it actually pulled in a lot of people who were very interested into playing the game. And within that, if let's say you pull in like 100,000 people, 5% of them spend maybe $100 on the game, for example, which is already a fairly low amount, all things considered. That's still $500,000 in profitability coming in during the period of the collab, assuming that people spent only that much during the entirety of its period. And with an IP that is that popular, you can expect that some of your own player base being very interested in it and already having a higher propensity to spend may also spend on it, and therefore it drives up the profitability of that event, both within the current active player base as well as within the overarching new players that are coming into the game to test out the title for the first time. That said, the reason why I'm saying that immediate profits are typically not the very first and number one priority for a collab, typically it's either the second or third priority, and instead DAU is simply because of the fact that if all you really wanted to do was make a lot of money in the short term, typically collabs just aren't a very cost-effective way to do it. And what better way to do it than to actually do a collab within the video itself and get our little slave friend here to do the explanation for us. Come on, chop chop. You're me from these more serious videos. What are you doing here? Yes, welcome to the collab. This doesn't feel. Hey! Come on now. I didn't bring you here to just stand around panic. Do your job. No, not the mines. Okay. Good. We'll do it. Good. Yes. Now, if you don't want to get sent back to the mines, you do your job good. Me, on the other hand, I've got a date with Destiny. You do this, and I'll be back later to finish up the video. Very different angles of doing things at. Well, now that the boomer is out of the way, let's get on with the video, I suppose. So the reason why he says that a collab is typically not a cost-efficient way to try and earn immediate profits is simply because, well, there are a lot more costs incurred with trying to implement a collab. For one thing, you have to take into account the amount of kickback that the IP holder would want in terms of direct profit cut that will go to them from their IP being in your game. And this amount can vary quite a lot. I think one of the biggest I saw was maybe something along the lines of, let's say, 30% thereabout. That I can't really exactly mention the company since that's all stuff that was under contract in the previous company I worked in and all. But 30% basically taken by the IP holder for doing basically next to nothing other than checking the work that you are providing, as for many titles order they actually prefer to create the content or the assets for the collab themselves. So things like your music, they might want to use something that's more of a remix of your own music with the IP holder's music, or you do the art, kind of like the Evangelion collab and Nikkei, or many of the Puzzles and Dragons collabs where they basically redraw the characters in the style of the game itself. And then maybe once in a while you might get like maybe the music or BGM from the original IP holder so that you can have something very close to it to give people more hype during the event itself as well. A lot more money tends to be burned in the bureaucracy itself as well, in terms of the fact that you basically need to typically spend more hours working on a collab than you do on a regular event, because there's a lot of things such as getting the confirmation of the IP holders, all of the networking as well as conversations between the two that typically are a lot slower than conversations that go on in-house, as well as all the checks and bouncing back that content typically will go through as they iterate upon what they feel is acceptable to have their IP represented as within your game. And the thing is, the bigger the power gap between the IP holder and your company as the company that's trying to get the collab running, the more that they can request for, and that you basically may not be able to push back on as hard or negotiate for an even better terms for yourself. Basically how much you have in DAU and profitability, which you can then show to the other company as proof that your game is something that can give them more reach, and therefore you can negotiate for a better rate for yourself. Furthermore, for fans of your title, and then I feel like this is something that any live service game, doesn't matter whether you're playing Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone, a mobile game like Blue Archive or Nikkei or something, most people typically can, and for fans of your title, they typically play your game because they kind of like the content that your game provides. And as a result, just because you collab with someone else's IP doesn't inherently mean that your internal player base are going to spend. And the thing is, more often than not, the people who are going to come into your game aren't going to be the people who are spending the most on it. Well, unless you just happen to strike it lucky and some Saudi oil princess or some like CEO of some telco company in China's son just happen to play your game or something. In that case, maybe you get like a bunch of nut jobs who just spend and outspend your entire player base till now. But typically the ones who will spend the most on your game are the people who already play it. And as a result, if your target is immediate profits, and by extension, your goal is then to basically target your own internal player base first, then you don't really need to go about trying to get a collab in for people to want to spend. There are much better and more natural ways that a game can go about doing this, such as a power creep, which may break some of the goodwill your fans have for your game if you're constantly doing that too much, but It is something, along with other things such as introducing new ways that people can spend money, such as skins and the like, that can basically get people who are already interested in your game to be willing to spend even more. And we can just look at something like Nikkei, for example, in the recent year and the year before. Wait, no, we're already in 2025. The year changes certainly have moved quite fast, I must say. But when we look at Nikkei from 2023 to 2024, what we do see is that for something like the Evangelion collab, for example, that was one of the best months they had in the year from statistics websites that are used within the industry. In the end, when you compare it to things such as your anniversary as well as the New Year period, it still kind of pales in comparison by quite a fair amount. And within this same year, you also did have the ReZero collab, which also did introduce characters from the IP itself. But as you can see from the graph over here, it still pales in comparison to all of the internal events that are being run by the company using their own internal IP. Meanwhile, when we look at 2023, the period when Nier released, that did super well. The fact of the matter is that no doubt some people within your fan base would definitely enjoy collabs, and the collabs are definitely going to be a good way for people to come into your game as well and spend more money on it. Or sometimes, I guess in the case of Nikkei, they might come in more than one ways, but typically it won't surpass the internal content within the game. Typically, the people who are newly coming in, even if they are willing to spend, there is a limit to how hard they will spend on the collab, even if they really like it a lot. And if it looks like the collab content is too unattainable, people are also less likely to spend, and worse still, they're also less likely to adopt your game, making it quite likely that you may not even achieve the level of DAU increase that the company might even have in the first place. So even then, though, companies still continue to do all of these collabs, and the likely reason is because while profits are also important, the more important goal is to actually draw in new players. Which basically a well done, well received collab, yes, it is going to increase your sales, yes, it is going to increase your DAU. It feels like these two are things that are going to be correlated to some extent, simply due to the fact that as more people come in, someone is going to spend, and therefore you're going to see an increase in sales the more the DAU actually increases. But what is more important than the immediate DAU as well as sales increase is the impact it has on ensuring that your DAU goes up or continues to stay at a certain level after that, so that the game can continue to grow going forward, in spite of the fact that it may be difficult for it to otherwise reach out to more people, because people within the space who already know of the game have already tried it and either are already playing it or have chosen not to play it. And so the goal with this is to basically reach out to people in other spaces, be it in like more hardcore gaming or maybe in the anime space, and try to pull them into playing your game, which they may have heard of from a friend but never really decided to try till this specific point, thereby allowing the game's player base to grow and eventually for the number of people who spend on the game to grow, therefore leading to sustainable long-term growth for the game. Wait, what? No, wait, please, no! Lil Punk, you stay in your short form and event videos. Don't make me get the Kasoge me to come out and beat you up as well. But anyway, where were we? So we do know why companies do it, but how do they do it is another important question that we have not yet answered. Typically, the lead or someone within the team whose job it is to look at all of this and figure out how to increase the DAU looks at what the game is currently doing and comes to the conclusion that all of the marketing that they are doing alone is just simply not enough anymore, as the reach has its limits as well. And so they decided they want to go about hosting a collab, and so they start to shortlist the number of IPs that they do want to work with and try to contact them to see who is open to a collab during the periods that the team might be actually interested in doing it for. There are multiple criteria that are involved in the decision making that a team might have on deciding what IPs to work with, but the most obvious one obviously is the popularity of the other IP. Needless to say, the more popular that IP is, the more eyes it can then pull onto your game, and therefore the likelihood of more people actually coming in from it throughout your game to get the thing that they like for their favorite IP in your game is going to increase, which therefore drives up both the sales as well as the DAU. But what typically drives out the sales more so than the DAU is not just the popularity of the IP, but the demographic of the fanbase of the IP, and that's another thing that you typically want to take into consideration as well. Is the genre as well as the level of spending required to get involved in your game something that the demographic of that IP would be interested in? If we step away from mobile games again and look at card games, you can just look at something like MTG, for example, right? You look at something like Lord of the Rings with the collab going on, I think it was in 2024. We're talking about an IP that basically boomers back in the day would have been more interested in. And I get it. I am a boomer myself. I'm a bit more of a Warhammer person than a Lord of the Rings person, but either way, both interesting IPs nonetheless. But let's face it, we're all kind of old. But the fact of the matter is that us being old and the demographic of the fans being older, there's something that will also make a level of consideration for whether or not to have the collab, because old people have more disposable income and may potentially, especially if you don't live in Japan and aren't severely overworked, you might also have the time to pick up this new entertainment medium that you're actually like interacting with. And so for something like a card game where you typically want people to buy packs or boosters, or in the worst case, you at least want your casual player base to be able to access the second-hand market to purchase the cards needed to play the game, you're going to need to target a demographic of people who do have the expendable, I guess the disposable income required to be able to get involved with the IP itself. Meanwhile, if your game is one that just has a much bigger adolescent player base, or you're one that wants to target that player base so that you can get people interested in your game early and therefore you can get a fresh new generation into the game, especially if you're something like League of Legends or Fortnite, for example, then maybe you don't want to do Lord of the Rings simply because of the fact that it is one that is going to target a much older generation that probably lived through the period where your game was popular and have already chosen not to interact with it. And so you go for a much younger player base of people who may have not ever tried your game before, and for whom they have less exposure to all the years of legacy or lineage behind it, and so they might be more willing to pick up the game. And that's where you go for something like a Skibbity Toilet Skin, because we truly do live in a society, don't we? Aside from that, there's also the ease of collab. And what I mean by ease is basically how easy it is to basically get all of the things that you want to do for the collab through the other party as well. With some parties, for example, with something like Disney, for example, they can tend to be a lot stricter in how their characters and from their IPs can be represented in your game. And so they might actually try to micromanage more of what you can do with the characters within the game itself. And this isn't just hyperbole, by the way. I actually do keep in contact with some of the people who worked in Puzzles and Dragons still, as they went through the whole like Marvel collab as well. And they actually mentioned how with the Marvel collab for Puzzles and Dragons, Disney was actually probably one of the most stringent IP holders that they have actually worked with, in the sense that while most IP holders, they would just want to look at like the character's art, they would check the skill names, the character dialogue and stuff like that. Basically the more world building stuff around the character, Disney was the only company that wanted to ensure that the parameters of your characters, like attack and defense stat, match what they felt like Captain America should be like. They would be the ones who would go like, oh yeah, but can we make his element within the game instead of light and dark for Captain America, make him fire and water, cause red, white and blue or something like that. And therefore you might see that things might get bounced back a lot more, which basically means added costs, which you don't want to incur depending on the situation. And so typically ease of collab is something that you would also measure as a metric beside the popularity as well as the demographic of the collab that you're trying to work with. Then, or it could just be the team's own preference. I feel like, especially in the East, sometimes you really just get the collabs happening because somebody or maybe a few people in the team really just feel like the theme of their thing and your thing just kind of matches, and because there are people in your team are also really old boomers, they kind of like enjoy the thing, and so you get things like the Blue Archive Railgun collab happening, which at this point I don't feel like Railgun is that massive of an IP either. Like, it feels like one of those that I lived through that period. I enjoyed the IP, but if I were to go to someone who's like 16 or 17 now, I don't think most of them would have even watched the IP or like interact with any of the content from it. And even for the people that like it, the amount of people who are very immensely strongly into it are probably a lot smaller, since it's an IP that is fairly old and doesn't have any huge marketing push on new like IP related like animes coming out recently either. The world setting is something that they can see there being a lot of commonalities in the theme and also in the way that the characters are depicted, and so it is something that they might also want to pursue, not just for the popularity of the IP, but because of the fact that it is something that the developers themselves may actually enjoy. And lastly, and this one might need a bit more of an explanation, is the idea of not going with competitor titles on competitor games. And what I mean by this is that the norm is that a company would not want to collab with a company that produces a title that might be competition for their own title as well. And the reason for this, especially for live service titles, is just more due to the fact that you don't want to suffer the potential risk of parts of your player base instead getting siphoned to the other game. Because here's the thing with most IPs in this day and age, right? Even if the IP doesn't require you to, on a daily basis, put in a lot of time to be able to consume its content, it is still something that you do need to put in a lot of time to consume the content over a long period of time. And what it would be really cool to basically get like a One Piece collab, for example, for your game, if it means that the people from your title who enjoy your thing are going to then have to go through like 1,000+ episodes just to watch some people struggle through like a bunch of things just because they didn't want to go to KFC instead, then it might be very problematic if people like go over to the other IP and just drop your thing in the process simply because it takes too long for them to actually catch up with the thing, but the thing actually got them hooked enough that they're interested enough to stay for the long haul there instead. Now, the thing with something like One Piece, for example, is that it's a different medium, right? It's anime as compared to games. So the way that people enjoy the mediums is very different. You could play a game while watching an anime, in fact, but it's a lot harder to play multiple games simultaneously. Yes, you could do it depending on the type of game, but typically there is a limited amount of time that people are willing to put into a specific part of their life. Because like, when it comes to stuff like anime and games, these are things that people might consider different facets of themselves. And so to ensure that you can balance all of your different interests, right? Gaming, anime, Gilgamesh, manga, you might want to put in time into each one individually. And so when people find that they are lacking in time for one thing, rather than say like taking away game time to boost for the anime, they might take away time from other anime to boost the time into the animes that they want to watch. And in this specific case, if you were to break it down even further, a live service game is gonna be the closest thing to another live service game because both of these typically tend to have the same styles of progression as well as the same amount of requirements for stuff like dailies or the like. And so if people feel like they're unable to keep up with both, they might choose to drop something from here first as compared to dropping something like, say, I don't know, playing like Madden or gambling on EA like FIFA or something. And the risk is especially high due to the fact that, as I mentioned before, typically during this collapse, and because of the way that most of these mobile games are designed, the earlier parts of the game are when the things tend to be the most rewarding because games are built by design to try to hook you and get you to progress and play a lot more early, get you interested in the game, and then slowly peter out in content over time. And so what this basically means is that you will tend to see the most rewards and time being the smoothest at the start of the game, as compared to at the end where there are typically more pain points, as you would call them in the industry, where there are points built into the game that try to convince people to spend by making things a little more difficult here and there. And so when you're in a situation where you have one game in that situation and one game in the what people would call the honeymoon phase where things are the most enjoyable, there is a very real risk of people from your game just hopping over to the other game and just staying there instead until this honeymoon phase ends, at which point they may not even choose to come back because of the amount of time investment in the short term that they have put into that title instead. And with even more time intensive games like MMOs where your dailies might take like 1 to 2 to 3 hours for all of the raids that you need to do and you're basically stuck in that grind, when a new title comes out and you're basically being rewarded for going over to explore that new title with basically endorsement from the title you're currently enjoying, I guess that's the big part of it as well. You do have an endorsement from the current title that you're enjoying that game is also good. And this makes it easier for you to then go over and try it and feel good about the fact that you're playing the other game as well. Then because of the fact that time is limited, you might find yourself just shifting more into that other game, and potentially in the long term, the people might just find themselves playing those titles more than the current titles simply because of the fact that you had the collab instead. That and such a collab typically doesn't help as much with new player acquisition because typically if it's a game within the same genre and the same space, the people within the space quite likely already know about your title, and the fact that they aren't playing it is because of the fact that they probably saw it release, maybe tried it out a little and felt like it wasn't for them. And while it is true that the endorsement from the other game that your game is something that's cool, hence why they're collaborating with it, might be something that could incentivize people to try out your game, it is also true that because of the limited size of the individual like user base within each of these individual genre spaces as well, the number of people you can reach out to who don't already know of your game and are therefore willing and likelier to try it out and stay for long is likely to be a lot smaller as well. Which is why collabs within the same space, especially for live service titles more so than consumer titles, tends to be rare. Because with a consumer title, your game once sold, you really get most of your profits within the first month. So even if a competitor releases a title that comes out next year, it doesn't really matter to you as much if you don't have a title that you yourself are releasing within that period. So it is more foreseeable that you could just collab with them and it's not going to harm you in any way whatsoever. If anything, it might actually bring more eyes to your game that's already out and cause people to purchase it, so it's more of a win. But with live servers, because your game is continually moving and continually requiring growth and more profits to come in, it typically does not help a company to achieve the main goals of wanting a collab more in the first place, which is why they are rare. And which is why something like the Limbus company Arknights collab is such a rarity, to be honest. Because like I think in the interviews they also did mention that they actually went down to the Arknights headquarters to like discuss with them how best to execute this collab. And it'll be interesting to see how the outcome or the results of this collab end up being like, as depending on how well this goes, it might actually result in a shift in the trends within the space itself, in a way that, while it may not necessarily benefit the companies themselves as much as a massive collab with a big anime IP or something, it is something that the player base, I can imagine, will enjoy, and there may be other benefits to it outside of what we might imagine, such as a shared ecosystem that they could create between themselves, which allows players to basically be retained better between both games, just simply because of the fact that you can now create some level of a cooperation to ensure that people who are interested in your thing and who have the spare time also plays that game, and therefore people are likelier to just stay within this ecosystem rather than going out and trying another game instead. That is a possibility, not necessarily something that will happen, but it'll be interesting to see how this collab actually impacts them in the future. That said, I feel like we spend a little too much time just talking about the criteria that companies look out for when they decide who to collab with. Now, if the other party is down for having a collab, what happens next then is that you basically need to decide all of the terms of the contract for the collab to happen. And this includes everything from when the collab would happen, the periods, if multiple periods exist. If you want to do a rerun or a second portion or a third part to it, when do you expect those to happen as well? Where is it happening? Is it just purely within the game? Is it going to happen in both games, as well as where are all of your different marketing resources going to end up being shown as well? What assets do you need from the other IP holder as well? You just need them to provide you with anything at all, or is it just that you just want the brand name and you would also prep all of the character art, the music and everything for the collab instead? What's the cut? I think this one goes without saying how much you're going to share with them revenue-wise. The involvement capacity of the parties involved, basically outlining what do they need to check, or perhaps them deciding what do they want to check when it comes to the content that you're producing, as well as how the marketing will be distributed or divided, whether they need to do it as well or will you be doing all of it. If both of you are doing it, then to what capacity are they involved with the marketing for this as well? And obviously when you talk about a contract, there's going to be the non-fulfillment penalties as well, because basically if the companies are both going to go into this, realistically speaking, even if you are the one as the game developer who's like putting all of the effort into ensuring it gets released, the other party still needs to put some of its man hours into ensuring that everything is up to the branding that they wish to portray. And so in the end, if you end up wasting their time and the collab just falls through instead, they want to ensure that there's some level of compensation that they can get. Once the terms are settled, the dev then moves on to creating all of the content required for the event, basically starting with the first draft where everything is still in the rough sketch phases for the art. Maybe the music as well is more just like the first draft of what they want it to sound like. And all of that will basically be sent to the IP holder for them to check and see if all of this is something that they approve of as well. Especially when it comes to the art and how the characters are depicted within the game. These are things that they tend to be a bit more stringent on. And so this will probably go through multiple checks starting with the initial draft. Meanwhile, on the opposing end, the dev will also be getting all of the deliverables that they would be expecting from the IP holder, and they'll basically be checking through it to see if everything that they need is there. So if they ask for things like a term glossary for all of the law-related terms within the IP itself, this will be where they check to ensure that everything that they need is there, as well as how updated all of that is. Voice lines or the art that's provided to them by the IP holder is enough, because sometimes they may actually just not provide you with the original thing that was used in the media itself. Sometimes some of that literally could just be lost because of poor like upkeeping on their end, and so they might provide you with a lower quality version of the thing, and then there's all of the discourse that comes on of whether or not you can get a higher quality version, but it doesn't exist, and then this and that, and then you have to decide whether or not you want to use it as is, or how best to mask it to make it look less bad. basically a lot of things that go in, and the devs will basically have to try and request and ensure that all of the content that is being passed to them is also appropriately usable within the game. And this will basically just continue to happen along the development cycle. As the drafts get more fleshed out during the relevant stages, all of this content will be sent to the IP holders to check. And once all of this is completed, depending on how stringent the other party is, they may ask for the playable version for them to actually test play to ensure that the experience that is being given with their characters are to what their expectations are. And some of them might actually believe that seeing it firsthand and seeing the impact might be better than any other form of check that can be done. And sometimes if the company just doesn't give a fuck, which it can happen, unfortunately enough, they might just ask you to just send them screenshots of every single page that is involved in the game itself. So like if there's a gacha page, for example, they ask you to send them a screenshot of the banner. Maybe they ask you to send them a screenshot of the character profile page, how the stages look and all of that. And when all of that is done and you as the company are ready to announce the fact that you're going through the collab, because typically you would get started on the work behind the collab first before announcing it, simply because if you announce it first, you're basically setting a potential deadline that in the worst case, if things go south, you may not be able to meet, which is risky for all parties involved. Typically, you would first develop all of it and then slowly move it on and announce it later on when it's all about ready to be. And when that happens, this is where the marketing on both sides would actually have to be done. Basically, if there is any form of marketing that you want them to do, for example, if you want Evangelion to announce that they're having a collab with Nikkei, for example, you basically have to have all of this basically stated to some extent within the contracts of how you would want them to basically assist with the marketing. And basically once it gets to that period, they will have to also then fulfill their segment of the marketing bargain as well. So yeah, fairly simple, to be honest, the process itself. Like when you actually explain it out, it's not like they're just going through like multiple mystical hoops to basically pray to the Slayer gods or whatever to ensure that all of the collab parts can just come together. It's just a lot of implementing it and producing it the way that you would typically produce content for your game, albeit with a lot more checks being involved and a lot more restrictions in the direction that you can take the content, because there's an additional external checker who is deciding the direction that the collab characters and assets can go in. The tough part comes when you have an IP holder who is a lot more particular about how they want their thing to be portrayed within your game, and as a result of that, there just happens to be a lot more back and forth as things bounce between the two, which can basically mean that the content that you're producing may take a lot longer to produce than expected, leading to more costs and potentially the risk of the collab not even making it in time, which basically means more suffering and work for everyone. Send help. More complicated still are global collabs, especially for titles or IPs that are much older, and this can be for a multitude of reasons. It could be due to the fact that the license holders may vary with the region. Like sometimes you might have it such that the people who hold the license for France, for example, for Hokuto no Ken may decide that, yeah, we don't really want violence in our Fist of the North Star, so we'll just have him be a tickle master who pokes people to submission instead. And then maybe in America they choose to remove the blood, or maybe they feel that certain skill names or abilities sound a little too satanic, so they shift it and change it for their individual regions. And so that can make a global collab a little difficult to coordinate, because you basically need the cooperation of the license holders across different regions, especially depending on the type of license that they hold. For older IPs especially, the law terminology itself may not even be consistent across regions, simply due to issues of how the media could be presented within the country. For example, you look at something like Yu-Gi-Oh! You had the Yu-Gi-Oh! 4Kids dub as well as the uncensored dub that was only sold within DVDs within America. And within the two, you already do have some level of difference. For example, in the episode where Kaiba asks Yugi to draw your last pathetic card, the skill that Yugi shouts at the end when Exodia actually uses the funny thing that he does when he draws all 5 cards is something that actually varies between the 2 cards. I think in the original 4Kids version, he just uses the word obliterate. And in the uncut version, he says something around the lines of Hellfire, Blast, Exodo, Flame or something. It basically varies quite a fair bit. In the case of Yu-Gi-Oh!, thankfully, while there was a lot of censorship for it that did happen within America at the time, a lot of the changes was something that it does seem like Konami did keep good track of. And so typically when a company tries to actually get a collab with something like Yu-Gi-Oh! For example, and they need to localize it for the foreign audience, it's a lot easier for them to then decide, okay, so which of these localizations do we go for? Which version of the art do we use? Do we still need to use the censored art in 2024? No, it depends on the card. And the thing is that at the very least, if the IP does a good job of keeping track of all of this, it's not an issue because you have a good glossary that they can provide and you know what you can therefore use in each of the regions. But when the IP holder doesn't keep a good track of it, and depending on the region, the individual license holders may have taken some level of liberties with it, there is the very real possibility that it's not going to be consistent what you should be using even, because the IP holders in Japan may not even know themselves what are all of the different variants that exist out there, because the lack of an understanding of English means that, especially for older titles, they may have just like passed it to a bunch of localization firms in the individual countries and let them settle it for themselves. And so you might end up in a situation where you just have multiple different versions of the same terminologies translation or localization. And at that point, like trying to figure out what you can and cannot use is going to be difficult because even the IP holder does not know. And so you need to basically go back to the drawing board and like converse and try to convince them of what might be best to use in certain situations. Adding on to this is also the fact that depending on the type of license that the license holders have actually managed to acquire, it very well could be the case that even if you manage to get the original holder of the IP within Japan to agree to the collab, it does not necessarily mean that the people or the license holders in the other regions are bound by the same requirements, and they might actually have the ability to just say no to the collab as well if it does not meet their own separate requirements as well. Like this was something I actually did have to deal with when I was working in Puzzles and Dragons as well. But what happened in that case is basically the team that manages the JP version of the game, by virtue of the fact that the JP version does a lot better sales-wise than the English version, they would try to push for as many and as good collabs as they can for the JP version first, and they just expect that the people managing the EN version would then be able to get the collab to go through in the other regions as well, by virtue of the fact that the license holders within Japan have already agreed to it. The issue is, sometimes the license holders overseas have something that is more akin to a master license, for example, which basically gives them the ability to manage most of what the IP basically releases outside of Japan. And what this basically resulted in was that after the JP version already released, the team that managed the EN version had to then contact the EN license holders in America instead. And when they did, the EN license holders basically tried to squeeze a much higher cut of the profits than the JP team actually did, because with some of these IPs, they just happen to be more popular overseas than within Japan. And so because of the fact that the license holders were trying to squeeze a much higher cut of the profits, the collab itself then became quite unsustainable for the team to even try to do, simply because of the fact that the player base is already not that big to begin with, and the demographic of people they felt they could target with the collab was also much smaller. And so it took about, I think, a year thereabout of just back and forth in terms of trying to argue for better rates before it finally reached the point where they actually agreed to having the collab instead. So this created a very weird gap, especially for a game where the meta is kind of defined by the collab characters as well, wherein you just didn't have access to all of the characters that you needed because a 1 year gap had basically already been created between the JP and the EN release of the characters, and there was still another half year before the actual implementation could take place. So by the time the characters release, they would be less than useful within the current meta, and during the current meta, you basically need to find ways to implement stop gaps or shift the schedule around to ensure that the content is actually clearable during that period as well. So things can and did get very messy back during that time. And it's not just mobile games as well. Y Schwartz, which is another card game, they did have a entire set for Magyar Record, as well as with Star Wars. And the thing with the two of those sets is that you couldn't actually use those two sets outside of Japan, simply because there was no way for them to apparently get the licenses for those two IPs to then be usable for sets outside of Japan. And what I mean by this is basically that you couldn't bring like Magyar Record cards, you couldn't bring Star Wars cards to tournaments within Southeast Asia, for example, because the cards were only licensed for use within Japan itself. In part, and this is especially the case with Disney in particular, they actually do look at this collabs as something that they strategically want to push in specific regions, and so they are willing to basically force you to only implement it in specific regions where they think there is a benefit, rather than saying like, oh, you want to implement a collab for the whole world? Yeah, that's great. That's more marketing for us. They are more likely to be like, yeah, but we don't need your thing in America. We know that our IP is already strong there. There is no added benefit for us to let you do the thing there. Your profit margin in those areas is going to be small, so we don't want you to actually implement it there. And as I mentioned before, this is probably because the IP holders too probably have an agenda that they want to push, be it that they want to release a new movie coming soon, and so they want to call up with you to drum up hype for the new movie as well, that like, oh, see, our anime is getting a new movie. Look, you can get our characters in this game as well. Or perhaps they just want to just get their IP out to more places so that people, especially for older IP, can just get their eyes onto their IP, and therefore more people can come and watch their show. And the importance of deadlines and timings in this sense are also a reason why sometimes a game may just not have a rerun of a specific collab, because the collab itself may have been predicated on the IP holder wanting to release something for the specific period for its specific goals. But once a year has passed, they may not necessarily have something more that they want to do with it because the movie has released or the book has already released months ago at that point. So they may not even want a rerun. And as a result, there just isn't one that is built onto the contract. I feel like I've been talking quite a fair bit right now, but all of this is what makes it such that while a collab is something that is fun, the players can enjoy a lot, and it's fun for the developers to create as well because it basically allows them to go out of their comfort zone once in a while. It's something that ends up being a lot harder to implement as well. And it's why sometimes when you look at collabs, there might be some very weird specific implementations that might seem a little iffy, kind of like with Azure Lane with the whole, when the Idolmaster collab happened, you couldn't have the marriage ring and instead you had to have a tiara because of the brand image that Bandai Namco wanted to push for the idols, for example. And this is also why certain IPs tend to pop up everywhere a lot more so than other IPs, such as ReZero, for example, which you may have seen like popping up in both MMO as well as like live service mobile game collabs, to the point that there are people who are just literally sick of seeing them in every single game that they play. And the reason why they are everywhere like this is because they are IP that is still fairly popular, that is easy to work with. Their terminology glossaries tend to be more comprehensive as well as consistent, in part because of the fact that the IP is more recent, in the sense that it's after the mid-2010s when it got a lot more popular. So when it comes to the control of all of these things and how they are localized overseas and how they are presented in other regions outside of Japan, it tends to be a little more organized, and they tend to have a better idea of all of it, and so they can basically provide the devs with a lot of this content which they can then use to basically quickly decide how best to select characters or what skills, how to depict the characters and all of that. And while it is a popular IP, they tend to not be as strict with how you can actually use their characters as well as their assets and content for your own depictions within the games that you're producing as well. So it is a lot easier to then like come up with like unique collab storylines and have them actually approve all of that. And they are also an IP that seems to be quite fairly aggressive in wanting to push for all of these collabs as well. So getting them to agree with another collab with another IP or another game that is actually fairly big as well is something that isn't too difficult to do. But that said, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you all for watching. This video, I think, is gonna end up being a lot longer than I initially expected it to be. So I do hope you found it informative on like how collabs, especially within the setting of like Japan and how Japanese games collab with other IPs out there and how all of that works to some extent. If there's anything else you're interested in knowing, be it more details on how collabs like this are actually executed, or if you have suggestions on other types of videos you might be interested in seeing with regards to the industry itself, do feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Or we have a Discord made by our very epic people like Snorlaxo, which you can feel free to join down in the description as well. And you can let me know there as well. And once again, thank you to the very cool people over here for helping to support the channel. It's thanks to you guys once again, as always, that I'm able to do like more of this type of videos and take myself back from work, as I always say, to be able to spend more time creating content like this as well. So much thanks. If you want to support the channel, the link is in the description down below as well. Everything's down there because I'm super organized. Just ignore the mess back there. I am clearly super organized, so everything is down in the description down below. That said, that's all for me for today. So thank you all for watching once again, and I'll see you all in the next one. But until then, take care and bye-bye.